All right, it's 1 o'clock. Welcome to our first installment of Science at Home. We're so excited to start our series today with Dr. Mike Koontz. First of all, my name is Katya. I'll be your moderator today. I'm an educator for CIRES and Education and Outreach. We'll be hosting this series weekly on Tuesday from 1 p.m. Mountain Time to 1:30. And we encourage you to join in with us every Tuesday. Our theme this month is natural hazards and resilience. You can find resources on the website, and we'll post that link at the end for activities that you can do at home and curriculum for the classroom. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Mike Koontz. Mike is a postdoc, so that means he's completed his PhD work and now he's doing some research at the University of Colorado Boulder with Dr. Jennifer Balch in the Earth Lab. Mike is originally from Maryland. He got interested in science and knew he could be a scientist when he was studying sea turtles in Hawaii. And so Mike's current research interests include how spatial patterns of vegetation structure and composition affect the resilience of forest to wildfire and bark beetle. So his goal in his research is to reveal how system-wide feedbacks in disturbance-prone forests. So that means what happens in these forests with disturbances such as bark beetle can be harnessed to guide effective management action. So it's a very timely topic as fires are burning across the western U.S. and we're excited to learn more from Mike today. Another housekeeping thing, Mike will chat for about 15 minutes. And as he's chatting, please put your questions in the Q&A box. And then at the end of Mike's talk, I'll be asking some of those questions. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. But thank you all so much for joining us. Dr. Koontz.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I'm seeing you all are joining us from Colorado, from Boulder, New York. So I'm here in Boulder, Colorado. And I'm super excited to be here to share some of my story with you all. And I want to make sure that I leave plenty of time for your questions about how I became a scientist, kind of what I do every day as a scientist, and some of the things that I'm learning about the science that I do in my work. So I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. Now, as Katya said, I'm Mike Koontz, and I'm a scientist. I got my PhD in a field called ecology, which is the study of life on Earth, all of the plants and all of the animals, the fungi, how they interact with each other, where they live, how they interact with their environment. And specifically, I study forests and how wildfires and bark beetles kill trees. And so let's pause for a second so I can ask you all, how many of you have been impacted maybe recently by wildfires or bark beetles? Maybe you've had to stay inside because the air was so smoky. And if we could shift to our next poll question, that would be great. Maybe you've had to stay inside because the air was too smoky, or maybe you've been driving up to the mountains to go snowboarding and you've seen lots of dead pine trees off the side of the highway. Maybe you've had to evacuate from a wildfire. How many of you have been impacted by wildfires or bark beetles? I'll give you 30 seconds to answer that. Let's see. Yeah, so I'm seeing some yeses, right? Good amount of people, and me too, right? Even aside from my work, I've had to worry about wildfire smoke recently, and those big patches of trees that you see, those dead trees off the highway, are super striking, right? They're really apparent. And some of the work that I do is super relevant right now, right? There's a lot of wildfires burning all over the western United States, and there's a lot of bark beetle killed trees too. And the title of this presentation suggests that it's about wildfires and bark beetles, forest insects, dead trees, drones, and satellites. So I'm going to give you a taste of what that might look like. So here's some drone imagery taken over a forest right after a fire in California. And you can see some trees survived, right? These green ones in the top left and some on the bottom.
Lots of these trees. I can't see your slides yet. Can you put those up? Sorry about that.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to replace your share with mine, and let's see if that works. How's that?
Yep, perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katya. Okay, so here's some drone imagery taken over a forest right after a fire in California. This is after the Tubbs fire. And you can see that some of these trees survived, these green ones in the top left and some of the ones on the bottom. And a lot of them burned, right? This whole area in the top right of this photograph used to be full of trees, and now you just see their sort of remnants. They're ashy ghosts there on the forest floor. And some of these trees were pretty well scorched, these brown ones, and so they probably died later. And here is a drone video showing thousands and thousands of dead trees that were killed by bark beetles, also in California. Now, when these trees fall over, they become fuel for a fire when it burns through. So the wildfires and bark beetles, they also coincide and they interact to affect the forest too. And this video is actually taken really close to where the Creek Fire is currently burning in California. So if you Google the Creek Fire, you can see kind of where this particular forest is. But lots and lots of dead trees. And this sort of speaks to the main motivation for all of my work throughout my whole career as a scientist. I want to use science to learn more about how nature works so that we can, as a society, do a better job of living with it, living with the natural world. You know, we want to make sure that species don't go extinct. We want to make sure that we have clean air and water. We want to make sure that we've got beautiful places to go and visit, to go and hike in or ski in or what have you. And to do that, we need to understand how nature works. Now, my work with forests, wildfire, and bark beetles is particularly interesting because bark beetles are supposed to be in these forests, and so is wildfire. Wildfire is supposed to be in these forests too, right? These forests are supposed to burn. And so we need to better understand them so that we can learn to live with these kinds of phenomenon, these wildfire and bark beetle killed trees. But I didn't always study forests, believe it or not. As Katya alluded to, I started as a scientist by working with sea turtles in Hawaii. So here's a group of us carrying a green sea turtle back to the ocean. They got stuck in this lagoon on the left side of these rocks, and they couldn't get back over the rocks to the ocean, so we carried them back over. And that's me there in the front. You can tell because I'm really ginger-haired. And we were actually studying the hawksbill sea turtle in this particular project, and it's critically endangered, so it means there's not very many left in the wild. And we're trying to better understand its nesting habits, like where it lays its eggs and how many mamas were laying eggs, so we could inform land managers how to protect them by doing things like keeping the lights off, because lights disorient those turtles and makes it harder for them to get back to the ocean, or by preventing people from driving on the beach, which crushes the sand, crushes the eggs, because they lay their eggs in the sand. They bury them. And I was also in Hawaii when I started working in forests. So I spent my time there building fences in the rainforest to keep pigs, which are an invasive species, from coming into the area with lots of native sensitive plants. And that's me there on the right. And here's what those fences do. So on the right is the forest where the pigs are kept out. And on the left is the forest where there are pigs. And again, these pigs are invasive. They're not supposed to be there. They were introduced to the islands. And they dig up the soil and they eat native plants, all of which evolved without pigs being around. So they have this negative effect on the forest health. So this was a direct management action to put up these fences in order to keep the pigs out. And so again, on the left, pigs were digging up this soil and making it really muddy. And on the right, that's more of what a natural Hawaiian rainforest would look like. And next, I went to college and graduate school. So I got a college degree in Hawaii and then a master's degree at Colorado State University. And that usually takes about 2 or 3 years. Then I earned a PhD in California, which usually takes about 5 to 7 years. So that's another 7 to 10 years of school, even after going to college. But I want to stress that you don't have to go to graduate school in order to be a scientist, right? That was the path that I happened to choose. And so one thing too that I never knew when I was in middle school or high school was that if you want to go to school, graduate school, to become a scientist, they pay you to go there. So it's a lot more like having a job than say going to an undergraduate college and getting a degree. And something else that I want to emphasize is that even though you might think of ecology as being a very sort of outside kind of a science, all of the work that I did for my master's degree was in the lab. We were trying to understand what made introductions of invasive species successful or not by measuring experimental invasions of flower beetles in these tiny little plastic habitats that you can see in the picture here. So these flower beetles lived in these little habitats. We counted them every few weeks. and then tracked their sort of invasion progress and what sort of factors went into making them a successful invader or not. And there was also a lot of genetics and molecular biology work associated with this particular project. So I guess the point is that there's a lot of different ways to be an ecologist. It's not just always outside doing field work. There's lots of great lab work and molecular biology kind of work that you can do too. And it takes some creative thinking to come up with ways to answer a particular question. So let's talk a little bit about what I'm learning in my most recent work. Now, I'm really interested in what's called forest structure, which we can think of as the shape of the forest. Where are the trees? Where are they physically located in the forest? How big are those trees? What species are they? How close together are they? How far apart are they? Do their crowns touch each other and interlac? Or are there big gaps between clumps of trees? And we can generally think of forest structure as being uniform, with all the trees kind of at the same height, or all of the trees evenly spaced out, with a full canopy that all touches each other, and it's just sort of one big even sea of trees. Or the forest structure can be highly variable, with clumps of trees and big gaps in between them, and you can think of it as sort of more bumpy. And there's good reason to think that forest structure, this shape of the forest, has a strong influence on how and where wildfires and bark beetles kill trees. And so that's a seed that I want to plant in your all's mind. Something that I hope you take away from this particular talk is that the shape of the forest really determines which trees die, where they die, and sort of dictates the patterns of mortality that you see. But it can be hard to show some of these patterns because you have to measure a lot of trees to see how it might be working. Now, if you haven't heard of bark beetles before, there are these tiny insects. Here's one on the palm of my hand. And they're able to kill entire big, healthy trees, right? They all team up on an individual tree, bore into the bark to eat the nutritious part of the tree trunk. And it takes thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of these individual tiny beetles ganging up on a single tree in order to overpower it, in order to overwhelm those trees' defenses. So I'm going to show you a video. This is sort of like a day in the life. So when these bark beetles bore into the tree trunk, they lay their eggs and they make these little tunnels. And we can see that by cutting away a piece of the bark, with a hatchet like we see in this video. So no trees were additionally harmed in the filming of this video. This is me taking a hatchet to an already dead tree and looking to see what killed that tree. We open it up with a hatchet and look on the inside to see those little tunnels that the beetles make when they bore into it. So in addition to using the drones and the satellites and some of the other things that I alluded to in this talk, it's also sort of nice to go out. I was camping to go out here and do this work. It's the field work part is definitely a fun part of it for me. So here we're peeling back this window of bark that we cut off. And I'll show you what that looks like. Watch me, I fall right here. There we go. And so you can see these tunnels, these galleries inside the bark that are sort of twisted and turning. And that's really characteristic of the particular kind of bark beetle that I was studying. And here's how we normally have to measure each tree. If we want to understand forest structure, right, we need to understand where these particular trees are and how big they are. So we take a physical measuring tape, wrap it around the base of the tree. We're really careful to measure it just right. And we measure that circumference and that diameter of the tree, just like that. So sort of real life tree hugging for a day job. But that's going to take forever, right? If we want to measure hundreds of trees or thousands of trees or tens of thousands of trees to answer an important question about how forest structure, that shape of the forest, affects wildfire or bark beetle insects, then this is going to take a really long time, so that's really challenging. So here's where we use drones. So with a camera on a drone, we're able to do these aerial surveys of a lot of forested area at once. And in our case, we flew over 40 hectares in a single site. Now, 1 hectare is about the same area as what's inside of a track. So if you imagine a track, like a track and field track, say there's a football field probably in the middle of it at a high school, right? But everything, all the grassy area within that track, that's about 1 hectare. So we're flying over 40 of those at once. And this drone flies this back and forth pattern like a lawnmower, and it takes lots and lots of pictures along the way. So for each of these sites, we were taking about 2,000 pictures. Every couple of seconds, we're taking another picture. And here's some actual footage of one of those sites flying over a dead patch of trees. So these are the real data that I'm collecting in the field from the drone. And again, we're taking 2,000 of these in a single site. We use a special software to take all 2,000 of these photos and stitch them together, which also allows us to generate a 3-dimensional model of the forest with measurements of all of those trees, with the heights of all of those trees. And there's thousands and thousands of trees in this one model. And so now we're able to measure sort of the shape of the forest, this forest structure, by flying the drone over the forest for, say, about an hour and a half, instead of spending what would have taken all summer long to go and measure these by hand in the same way that I showed you in that video before. So this is the output of putting all of those 2-dimensional photographs that overlap with each other from a single site into this special software that creates a 3-dimensional model. So now we can measure the trees from the air, and we've overcome a really important challenge to learning about how bark beetles and wildfires behave in a forest. So with all of these measurements, we can learn some really interesting things about how forest structure, the shape of the forest, affects wildfires and bark beetles. So for instance, we learned the more variable the forest structure is, with lots of clumps and big gaps between the trees, it makes fires less severe when they come and burn through a particular area. Those fires kill fewer trees when the forest structure is more variable, when it's more sort of bumpy with gaps in between the trees. And we also learned that it's the biggest trees that most likely get killed by bark beetles, and that's especially true when the site is really hot and really dry. And so those are some of the key findings that I'm learning about right now in using drones as a novel way, a new way to learn about forest structure and about how wildfires and bark beetles are interacting on the landscape. So thanks very much for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have now, either about this work or about how I became a scientist, what I do day to day. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Mike. So folks, our viewers, please go ahead and put questions in the Q&A, and then we'll address those as they come up. A first question is, how can you tell the difference between a dead and a live tree with your software?
That is a great question. And sorry, I'm going to put this photo back up so it stays there. So you can see in this photograph here, this is actually another aerial picture of all of those photographs stitched together. And so our eye is able to detect, well, those brown trees are definitely dead, right? And the green ones are probably alive. And so for me, it was a matter of detecting individual trees within these 3-dimensional models, and then looking how brown the pixels were from those photographs within those tree crowns. So if it was a very brown tree crown, we said that one was dead. And if it was a green tree crown, then we said that one was alive. Yeah, really good question.
Great. Keep those questions coming. I have a question. When bark beetles kill a large patch of forest, is that forest, I know there's some debate in the science community and disagreement, is that forest more likely to burn if it's been killed by bark beetles?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things going on there. I wouldn't say that it's more likely to burn, right? Because a wildfire gets started by an ignition, right? And it's not like a wildfire spreading through a forest is going to kind of guide itself over to where the dead trees are. But what really matters is how long after those trees are dead. If a wildfire is going to come through an area, if those trees are recently dead and they still sort of have all of their brown needles on them, then that can make a wildfire really intense because there's all of this fuel up in the canopy and it can sort of charge through those areas. But then there's a period where all of the needles drop off, and now these, they call them snags, a dead tree in the forest with no needles, those don't carry fire all that well, right? And so if a fire comes up to an area where the bark beetles killed them several years ago and all of the needles are off, that fire is probably not going to move as quickly or as intensely through that particular area. But to complicate matters even more, after those trees fall down on the ground, now it's just like a bunch of logs all over the ground, and that surface fuel becomes really important for making a fire really, really intense. And so it sort of depends on how long ago the trees were dead. Once those trees fall on the ground, they can be really make a fire a lot more intense when one comes through.
Great, thank you. Another question from our audience: is there a connection between climate change and bark beetle spread?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So the answer is yes. So climate change makes the atmosphere warmer. That makes the atmosphere drier, and that makes the trees more water stressed, right? When the trees are water stressed, they are more vulnerable to bark beetles. And so, for instance, the work that I did for my dissertation was looking at the amount of dead trees in California, and there was this massive mortality event, right? Hundreds of millions of trees died during that really hot drought, and that was largely a climate change type drought, the kind of drought that we would expect to see with climate change, where it's both no precipitation and really hot temperatures too, that make those trees a lot more vulnerable.
That area that you studied, was that in California, and is some of that area burning currently?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So some of these very sites that I flew have been burned over by the Creek Fire, which is the one that's burning just east of Fresno, California. If you Google Fresno, California, and the Creek Fire, you'll see some of these sites in the Sierra Nevada mountain range are getting burned.
It's wild. Another question from our audience: is the aerial photography done in summer when everything should be green? Do you do it just in summer or year round?
That's good. So I have only done it in the summer, right? So for this particular project, I think that I took all of these photos between April and July. And yeah, so the things that were alive should have been green by then. But yeah, it might be a totally different story, or you might be able to ask entirely different questions if you were to go do something of this with, say, snow on the ground or something like that.
Another question for you: how did you first become interested in this research?
Yeah, so I think I showed some photos of, I know I showed some photos of me building fence back in Hawaii. I think I was looking pretty sad in that photograph. It was a rainforest and it was really cold. And so that project, it was miserable on that one day, but I really loved forests thereafter. And so I was really interested, specifically for my PhD, in understanding this sort of spatial question about where the trees are and how that affects these disturbances like wildfires and bark beetles. So for me, it sort of combined all of these things that I was already really interested in. For my master's work, I worked on beetles, even though it was a different kind of beetle. I had worked on forests in the past. I guess the overall driver, though, was that it's a really important question right now, right? These dead trees, either from a wildfire or from bark beetle kill, it has pretty important societal implications for how we are living in these areas that are prone to these kinds of disturbances. So for me, it was a way to do science that was really important to society too.
One other question: how has your work changed as a scientist with the pandemic?
Yeah, so I haven't done any field work in the entirety of the pandemic. So that's certainly something, right? There's a lot that we can do, and I alluded to this with the lab work that I talked about during my master's. There's a lot of different ways that you can be an ecologist, but for me, one of the main ways was going out into the field and being in the forest and working with the trees up close, in addition to working with them from the drone. And so that's been a lot harder to get out there and be in the field.
So can you clarify, I know scientists use the word field a lot. Can you clarify what does it mean when you go to the field?
Yeah, so and that can mean a bunch of different things, what the field is. So for me, a lot of this work happened in the forest, right? So I'd load up my truck with the drone equipment and my camping equipment, and my dog came with me, and we would go out, drive on these, like you can see in this photograph, some of these four-wheel drive, gnarly roads to get to these deep into the forest and some of these sites. We'd camp at those particular sites, make all our food there, sleep there, everything. And then, be doing the drone work during the day. And so for me, the field is like being out there in the forest. But that can be any number of things, right? Like it's one really, really interesting field of ecology is what's called urban ecology, where you're doing work about all of the critters that are, and the plants that are living within a city or within a suburb. And that's super important work too, right? That's a primary way that humans are interacting with nature. And so understanding the dynamics of some of those processes that are happening on the city streets or in the meridians in a highway. That's all really important too. And that could be the field as well.
Cool. One last question. How many trees can beetles eat in a day?
Oh man, let's see. That's a really good question. So, gosh. Well, okay, let's work this out, right? There were 150 million trees killed between 2012 and 2015 or so in California. So, it takes them about 6 to 8 weeks to lay their eggs and develop from eggs into adults, which then can fly to the next tree and, attack and kill that one, right? So any given generation of beetles, it's going to take a couple months before they're able to get to the next tree. But because there's so many of them and because they're all over the forest, they could be eating, thousands of trees in a day. But a single beetle or a single set of beetles, they're only going to eat one tree.
How many beetles does it take to kill a tree?
Yeah, so that's also interesting. It depends on how big the tree is. So if the tree is really small, they tend to be less well defended. So one of the main ways that a tree is pretty dangerous prey, right? If a beetle goes to try to kill a tree, that tree doesn't want to die. And so what it does is it takes its sap and it pushes the beetle out, right? It floods those boreholes with sap to push them out of the tree. And the smaller trees aren't able to do that as well. And so it takes fewer beetles rather to kill a small tree, maybe only a few thousand. But for a really, really big tree that's really well defended, it might take tens of thousands of beetles on a single tree just to kill that one.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for your talk today. It's very interesting. And thank you all for joining us for our first Science at Home event. A reminder, these are every Tuesday from 1 o'clock Mountain Time to 1:30. Next week, we will continue on our theme of natural hazards and resilience. We'll have Dr. Joshua Schwartz presenting about wildfires and crop burning smoke. And another reminder, you can find resources on our CIRES Education and Outreach website, and those resources include some curriculum and activities about wildfire that you can do at home. And I'll put this link right in the Q&A as an announcement that you can find the website for today's talk that has recommended activities to do at home. And one more thing, these talks will be recorded and posted on our website. And I think that's all we have for today. Thank you all so much for joining, and have a great rest of your week. And thanks, Dr. Koontz. Have a good one.
My pleasure.